You are listening to Perplexity.
Investigators believe the victims were probably shot. Neighbours can hardly believe it.
On a revu son mari.
We saw the husband, about 15 days ago. He parked the car opposite the house and loaded up food bags.
The inquiry has unfortunately now become a criminal investigation into kidnap and murder. We know very little. It was a family who no one really spoke about, who seemed to have been quite turned in on themselves, though the father was often away for professional reasons.
Today, we will be discussing arguably the most famous murder mystery in the history of France. Our story takes place in Nantes, the sixth largest city in France, with over 320,000 residents. During the 15th century, it was the primary residence of dukes of Brittany-Rennes, and in the 17th century, it gradually became the largest port in France. It's the third highest ranking city in France in terms of urban development, population, finances, and companies that it has to offer. It includes a historical center with old monuments, administrative buildings, and small shops. The cost of living here is considered expensive, and the homicide rate in France during this time was about 1 in every 100,000 people. So when 4 children, a mother, and their 2 dogs were found brutally murdered, dismembered, and buried in their backyard, the story would understandably shock the country and the world. On April 21st, 2011, the police discovered the bodies of Agnes, her 4 children, Achu, Thomas, Anne, and Benoît, and their 2 Labrador dogs at 55 Boulevard Schuman in Nantes Loire-Atlantique, France. Agnes's husband, Xavier, was nowhere to be found. And this was a picture-perfect family, stemming from nobility and Catholicism. They were full of personality, they were highly intelligent, they were talented, well-known, and highly involved in their community. But throughout the police's investigation into these murders, it became apparent to police this family had very deep and troubling secrets. In the coming weeks, Xavier would become the prime suspect in the murders. He remains missing to this day. This is L'Affaire Dupont de Ligonnès, the case of the Dupont de Ligonnès family. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Perplexity, a mystery podcast. As always, I am your host, Kadra. If you're new to the show, hello and welcome. I tell tales every single week that have perplexed me. So if you love a good mystery that leaves you wanting more, don't worry, you're in the right place. And if you end up enjoying today's episode, I would love if you continue to follow along and tune in for part 2, as this is going to be a true crime deep dive. If you are a returning listener, hello, my friends, welcome back. I'm very happy you're here. I have a wild story for you guys today. Today we're talking about Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès and the Dupont de Ligonnès murders. This has been a rabbit hole. I've been researching this case for well over a month now. I want to thank Adelaide for requesting this story and helping me with the French pronunciations. But full disclaimer, in case you guys didn't know, I am not from France. So I'm saying these words as best I can. I got the pronunciations from her, wrote them phonetically, and practiced them, but I apologize if I say them wrong. I don't mean to offend anyone, but I thought it was more appropriate to use the pronunciations, especially for these victims' names. This story has been such a rabbit hole for me. I just kept falling deeper and deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole until I was like, okay, I need to stop. This has to be 2 parts, and I'm just gonna give you guys a ton of information because this case on the surface and the way that the media portrays it a lot of the time, in my opinion, is very different than what actually happened. So we'll talk about that more as the story progresses, but be sure to tune in next week for part 2. This episode will contain disturbing content. Listener discretion is advised, and all the sources used for today's episode will be down in the show notes. So without further ado, let's get into this story of the Dupont de Ligonnès murders. Chapter 1, The Golden Family. Achu, the oldest, was born in 1990. He was not Xavier's biological son. We'll talk more about that later. Achu was 20 years old when he was murdered, and he had been pursuing a degree in engineering at a private Catholic college. Achu also had a girlfriend and worked at a local pizzeria. Thomas was 18 at the time that he was murdered. He was Xavier's oldest biological son. He was very close to his family. He was known to be shy, lighthearted, cheerful, happy, and sweet. He had a deep passion for music and was studying musicology. Anne was 16 years old at the time of her murder, and she was the family's only daughter. She was a model for mail-order catalogs. She was also very studious and attended the private Catholic high school La Perverie. Benoît was 13 at the time of his murder, the youngest of the family. He attended the same school as Anne, La Perverie. Like his oldest brother, he also loved music, and he played the drums. He was known to get very good grades. You could see from the outside how this was a seemingly golden family. The family was tucked away as well in a lovely home in a large French city, situated in the west of France on the Atlantic Ocean. This is a peaceful and tranquil area full of culture. The family was well accomplished, intelligent, talented, and attractive. Xavier knew how to make his family look good to outsiders. On the surface, this story, like many other cases of familicide, seems unbelievable and confusing. How could a man seemingly murder his wife, 4 children, and 2 dogs, then disappear? There seems to be no reason. The family appeared well off, accomplished, and happy. I initially came across conspiracies about how Xavier, this perfect man, was framed, murdered, and even that the family's deaths were some elaborate hoax. But the deeper I dug into this case, it became quite clear to me that Xavier was, in my opinion, a very dangerous, controlling, narcissistic person and a liar who murdered his entire family. Agnes was the personable matriarch of the family. She worked at a Catholic school and led a Bible study group. She was known to be very devout, attending Mass every Sunday. She was kind and soft-spoken, but behind closed doors, Agnes was in a toxic marriage that had been filled with trouble from the start. Xavier's father, Hubert, was a prestigious noble and count. His family's lineage can be traced back to the 1500s. Their coat of arms has a gold helmet and 3 silver stars. Amongst Xavier's family were politicians, writers, and civil rights activists. Xavier would become the recipient of the Count title. His family's titles were of great importance to him. Xavier once said, quote, "I think I've got a superiority complex. You could call it that. I belong to a group of people who were highly intelligent, determined, balanced, and in good moral and physical standing. Such people are rare compared to the masses." End quote. Xavier's relationship with his father had always been complicated. Growing up, he was allowed just 10 seconds at the end of each day to speak with his father on casual matters. His father also left his family when he was very young. Hubert ran off with a mistress. Xavier was left to support his mother and his sisters, Veronique and Christine. In his younger years, Xavier's mother, Genevieve, started a religious sect that some may consider a cult. This was known as the Philadelphia Church. Genevieve believed the Catholic Church had become corrupt and was being taken over by the devil. She required the children in this group to unlearn ideologies taught in school. Members were expected to follow a strict dress code and diet, and she also took money from her followers. A prominent church figure in France, Father Jean de la Villarmois, became aware of the Church of Philadelphia, calling it, quote, "a sectarian group manipulated by a sick person." Xavier had known his wife Agnes since high school, and they became engaged just a few years after graduating. But their relationship fell apart when Xavier cheated on Agnes with a girl that he met on vacation. During this time, he broke up with Agnes, saying he wasn't ready to settle down and he wanted to travel. He spent a lot of time in the US with his best friend, Michelle. During this time, they wandered the country, making money with an import scheme that they had concocted to dodge taxes and bring luxury cars back to France. After traveling for a while, Xavier returned to France in 1989 and reunited with Agnes. But it was complicated. Agnes had met someone else, became pregnant, and had her first son, Achu. Agnes had come from a Catholic family, very conservative religious values, so when she became pregnant out of wedlock, it was seen as quite taboo. Xavier kind of appeared as like the stepfather, the father that stepped up, who was willing to come in, take care of Achu, and see him as his own son. Achu was born in 1990. Xavier and Agnes married just 1 year later in 1991. In 1994, Genevieve, Xavier's mother, began to speak of an imminent end to the world. And she said a new world would be created for her faithful followers. She began doomsday prepping, and this was in one of the family's country homes. She was filling it with all these canned goods and supplies. She also prophesied that her daughter Christine would give birth to a child whom she dubbed the Xavier. She invited her followers together to their family estate, but when they arrived, they found Genevieve was not there, just Christine. Christine was 29 years old at the time, and she explained that the apocalypse would begin after the followers impregnated Christine. All of the male followers of the Philadelphia church would need to sleep with her. So the men slept with Christine. And the next day, when they found the apocalypse didn't happen, some people began to open their eyes and leave this insane group. It's not clear how involved Xavier was in the Philadelphia church, but I bring all of this up because it plays into theories surrounding the case later. It was unclear to those around Xavier what he actually did for a living. Some people thought he sold ad space, other people thought he imported wood, but he claimed to make 5 figures a month. In the early 2000s, Xavier did try to relocate his family to the United States in Florida, but this was not a success. He had a failed American dream, and he spent all of his money. And this is really when the Dupont de Ligonnès family had this big turn. Their financial troubles really started to begin. Agnes had 350,000 euros of inheritance from her parents set aside, but she had to use all of this money to pull Xavier and her family out of this financial hole. In 2004, Agnes posted anonymously on a forum about how she was very unhappy in her marriage. She said, quote, "I am lacking in everything: tenderness, love, mutual friends, sex, everything. I have a husband who is very old-fashioned in his ways of being in the family. The father is the head, he gives an order, we execute it without seeming to question or understand, period." In another post, she wrote, "Xavier is too judgmental, too quick to argue, too rigid, too military. There's no tenderness between us, no more attention, no softness, no sex. He hates when we tell him his behavior is unacceptable. He feels attacked and humiliated. And when I ask him if he is happy, his response is always the same. Yes, I am, but if we could all die tomorrow, that would be better." End quote. And several years later, Agnes, her 4 children, and their 2 dogs would be found murdered and dismembered in their backyard. Hearing these types of words from the husband who has never been found, it's quite ominous. Xavier and Agnes had also been separated multiple times during their marriage. There was a 3-month period in 2005 where Agnes and Xavier were separated, and Agnes lost 20 kilos from stress. Xavier had been having an affair with a woman named Catherine, who we will discuss more later. It's also been alleged that throughout their marriage, Xavier had affairs with multiple women. On July 22, 2005, Agnes went to the Nantes police station to give a written statement. She indicated that before her and her husband separated, Xavier punched Achu. Agnes wrote that she, quote, "is afraid of his behavior, fears a recurrence, and reserves the right to file a formal complaint against him if such events occur again." End quote. Later that same year, Xavier wrote an odd letter to his family, explaining he and Agnes had gotten back together. But through this letter, you really can see the toxicity in this relationship, his narcissism, his constant need to be in a positive light by others, and he even blamed Agnes for all of their financial difficulties. Chapter 2. Save Face. In 2005, Xavier wrote to his family, quote, "The delicate period between Agnes and me is definitely over. I came home on October 14th because Agnes finally accepted my return, since our separation was her choice and not mine. And she confessed the truth to me on November 20th. Everything I told you in my first open letter in early July, which many of you did not even consider, instead believing that I had a fit of rage, was absolutely accurate, and what I assumed and exposed in a second mail, sent only to some of you, was also accurate. Agnes, having been in direct contact with you, has no reason to send you a letter, but she understands very well that I am writing to you in an attempt to erase the negative image of me she may have given you, and that you gladly believed, which disappointed me very much on your part, when I had taken the trouble to explain to you what was really occurring. I hope that the maxim, meditate, there will always be something left, will not prove to be accurate as far as I am concerned. Here's what Agnes wanted me to write to you. Quote, I am writing you in a general letter to confess my wrongs and ask for your forgiveness. It's not easy, believe me, and I'm only doing this to rehabilitate Xavier. I misinformed you this summer when explaining the situation between Xavier and me. I don't use the term lie because it was not intentional. I had managed to persuade myself. I have probably allowed some of you to have a very negative, totally false and misleading image of Xavier. My only excuse is that I was sincere because that was the image I had of him for several years. An image that so-called friends helped put into my head with false revelations and persuasive insinuations in order to swindle me more easily by separating me from him, who has his feet on the ground and does not allow himself to be fooled. These suggestions were coming at me from all angles, and only Xavier's reaction, which I found violent in July, is what saved our family. For several years, but especially in the last 2 years, I have been influenced by bad friends who have dragged me down to unhealthy depths and made me do reprehensible things, all of which I just confessed to Xavier. My conduct was notably dictated to me by a smothering fortune teller, who I now realize is a charlatan without any paranormal powers and a crook who exploits gullible women. I prefer not to go into detail, and I count on you not to question me on this subject further. Xavier has had the immense kindness to forgive me and continues to bring me all of his love, just as he has always done, and I hope it will be the same for you, knowing how painful it is for me to make these confessions. I promised him that I would no longer let myself be drawn into various mystical practices, and I have voluntarily erased some people from my mind. We're trying to clean up the last 2 years and rebuild our relationship on a healthy and solid foundation. I want to rehabilitate Xavier myself, because I hope that he is able to be with you without seeing in your eyes the image I have been able to portray of him. In 14 years of marriage, he has never deceived me, even though I was almost able to believe it, and I conveyed this doubt to some of you. He's also not violent with our children, although I misunderstood the fact that he beat up Achu, who had violently assaulted Thomas. But one good spanking in 3 years is not child abuse. He's never ridden my coattails or squandered my inheritance. He works a lot, and we've spent all of his income and part of my inheritance to live well. That is all. These were mutually agreed choices that only concern us. I have faith in his projects, which are now well advanced and promising, and I regret that I put a damper on him and made him lose 6 precious months. We are going to take this seriously now, and I'm going to help him by working with him instead of spending hours being influenced by unhealthy conversations with friends and on internet forums. May those who believe that I fell under the thumb of Xavier, as I was able to convey in the previous messages, be reassured. I am sincere, I act voluntarily, and it is our love that saves us. I embrace you all. Thank you again for your support, which comforted me this summer, because despite everything, without Xavier, I was truly lost and confused, and I count on your loving understanding. Again, I am so sorry, Agnes. And we're not done. I have more to read from Xavier, but I've got to point some things out here. So first of all, obviously, anytime that someone is having to apologize for their behavior and their spouse and they're writing it openly to their family, this is already such like a personal touchy thing, but I really feel like the wording in this indicates Agnes is writing this because she is being controlled and manipulated, gaslit by Xavier, and he hates the idea of anyone seeing him in this negative light. It's really giving toxic and insecure to me. As someone who has been in an abusive relationship myself and escaped one, it's very telling to me. Like, these are clear signs, in my opinion, of toxicity and abuse. I think that she tried to get help and was trying to like reach out to internet forums and friends and family. And when Xavier found out, she got scared because he's a dangerous person. And so then she tried to apologize and backtrack for her safety and probably for her children's safety. And now Xavier is trying to save face by writing all these letters, but in my opinion, it makes him look so much worse. It's really creepy. And like the lengths that he goes to, these insanely long letters he's writing, it's just like so desperate. So I know this is long, but I felt like this gives a lot of context into the story. So I have a little bit more of Xavier's letter to read. Here is what Agnes will be able to confirm to you in person. She participated in this letter and endorses it. I'm sorry that since July, I have been obliged to share with you some rather intimate details about us that you normally would not really care to hear about. But I had to react to save our family and restore the truth, because I knew that Agnes was talking with everyone and giving them false information. I blame some of you for encouraging her in her attitude and for encouraging her to start a separation procedure. But I thank you for being there for her, even if it was against me. Xavier. So in Agnes's letter, just to give a little bit more context, she talks about how she had gone to see this fortune teller and how she was reaching out on these internet forums. This kind of adds another layer to the story of Agnes because she was always seen as this very devout, Catholic, kind of goody two-shoes woman. She really had more of an open view of the world from what I've gathered. She was willing to talk to all different kinds of people. She's desperate for answers of what's going to happen with her family. So she started going to these fortune tellers. She was interested in the paranormal and looking into that. And Xavier, being highly insecure and worried about how the community and his family is going to view him, I think that upset him and scared him because it's basically decreasing the chances that he's going to be able to maintain control of Agnes, because if she starts believing something else, that can make his power slip. So by the end of 2005, Agnes only had 46,000 euros left from her 350,000 euros inheritance, because financially they were continuing to bleed. In 2006, Agnes began having an emotional affair with Xavier's best friend, Michel. Agnes insisted that her and Michel were never physically intimate. Xavier, instead of ending his friendship with Michel, actually just went to his house and asked him, get this, if he wanted to share Agnes with him. And this is where the story really took a turn for me. I found this to be very shocking. It is alleged, according to this French book about this case, that at this point, the three of them then went to a hotel for 2 days and they all slept together. They continued having numerous threesomes at various hotels, and Xavier allegedly even made a sex tape. Xavier also wrote letters to Agnes and Michel in 2006 that indicate he was not in a good psychological state. Shocking. An affair with your wife and best friend didn't go well. On March 15th, 2007, it is clear that Xavier was still not over this affair. He wrote to Agnes, quote, "I will spend my days cursing you for destroying my world and suspecting you of continuing to drive a knife into my back. 2 months later, he emailed Agnes on May 29th saying, quote, "It turns out that when it happens, it's actually very difficult, even impossible in my opinion, to once again trust the one who has already betrayed him. I therefore no longer have any problem trusting you. Having abolished the exclusivity of our sexual relationship, there is no longer any trust to have. The question of whether I trust you can no longer be raised. The problem is solved." End quote. Which, I gotta say, is pretty rich coming from a guy who had already had affairs with allegedly up to 4 women. I'm not saying that what Agnes did is quote-unquote right, but I also feel like she was in an abusive relationship and was probably trying to do literally anything she could to get out of it. And it just didn't work. In 2007, Agnes began binge eating and had become addicted to the internet. She reported feeling very isolated, trapped, and fatigued. Some friends would later say in 2008, when they saw her, she had gained a lot of weight as well, and she seemed to be in this state of mental disarray, and she seemed depressed. Now, going back to the Philadelphia church for a second, Xavier's mom, Genevieve, and that whole cult situation. It was discovered in 2009 that this group was still active. Xavier and his mom had kind of had this falling out. They hadn't talked for a while, but in 2009, they reconnected. Agnes also started to later talk to some friends about how she was very afraid of her mother-in-law. Xavier in his adult life became a businessman, but was never successful, despite what he painted himself to be. Basically, he started a Ponzi, and he ended up owing a lot of people money. He owed Ursaf, several of his friends, family members, and loan services hundreds of thousands of dollars. In February 2009, 2 years before the murders, Xavier resumed contact with a former childhood friend, Catherine, who was also his first kiss. Catherine was married, but allegedly, Xavier and Catherine began an affair. He also convinced her to invest in a new business plan that he called the Crystal Project. He ended up scamming her and her family out of €50,000. By October of 2009, Xavier was out of money again and told Catherine he had not invested any of her money in this quote-unquote business project. He had actually spent everything. He wrote an email to Catherine, January 14th, 2010, making some very troubling statements. Here's a quote from the email. "I am ruined, in the bottom of the hole, as I have never been. I have 4 months of unpaid rent. I couldn't pay Achu's school. My car broke down, and I was forced to ask Mom to buy Christmas presents for the children, and I have to pay her back. I have new bailiffs on my butt. I can be kicked out of my home, and I have no money to finish the month of January. To date, I have €100 left for my return costs in Nantes, and €500 for food shopping by the end of the month. I have to theoretically take out €15,000 in 15 days. Rents, Osidic, Ursaf, Mom, schools, insurance, water, etc. And it would only take an additional €10,000 to print my crystal tickets, my envelopes, and sell them. And of course, I can't find anyone to advance me €25,000. I can't sleep anymore. I have insomnia almost every night with morbid ideas. To fuck up everyone in my house after giving everyone a sleeping pill. Fuck myself up so that Agnes gets €600,000. I wake every morning with unbearable anxiety attacks, some of which last until noon, with difficulty breathing and racing heartbeat. I know no worse than these anxiety attacks. I've never had a nervous breakdown. I wonder how it feels because I don't know anyone who can go through as much stress as mine and not fall into depression or immediate suicide. I didn't want to talk about work yesterday. I did not want to throw away our delicious moment. And I didn't want to think about anything. Stress and anxiety are not very compatible with erection. I have not been at the top for you, but I'm still quite happy to have been able to give you a little pleasure. My stress state explains in part that I no longer have any sexual activity, even though, of course, I hide reality from Agnes, who still sees that it's not going at all. She sees me drinking too much and getting soaked up in sweat of anguish in the middle of the night every night." End quote. What I find so crazy about this story is that Xavier documents everything. He had endless voicemails, text messages, emails, letters. This man was always talking and always writing. You can learn so much about a person from reading what they've written. He is talking about and foreshadowing what is going to happen to his family. He's talking about how he's in financial ruin. He's openly talking about this affair, and he's very clearly stressed about finances. After a few months of conflict with Catherine and her family, because remember, he scammed her out of all this money, by the time it was July 2010, it's like the wool had finally been lifted from Catherine's eyes, and she knew she was played. Xavier had used her for money. So she starts to make these demands. She's like, "No, screw you, I need my money back." And on July 5th, Xavier received an email from her saying that she was talking to lawyers. By the time it was July 11th, Xavier began to speak with his close friends, Michelle and Emmanuel. He said, quote, "I will therefore be, by late August, early September, at the foot of the wall with a final decision to make. Suicide alone or collective suicide." He also told them he was thinking about, quote, "shooting up the house while everyone is sleeping." So it's not like this was some big shock. He's talking openly to Catherine, to his friends, about the things that he's willing to do to, quote unquote, get out of this situation. Xavier was also very compulsive and controlling of his relationship and his kids. He's clearly obsessed with money. He was known to read Agnes's texts and emails. He also kept a document on his computer detailing the amount that his children had cost him since they were born. And like he mentioned in his email, he was drinking heavily during this time. That same year, Agnes started spending more time on hookup websites like J'étais plat or Play. And now we get to 2011, the year of the murders. On January 20th, 3 months before the murders, Xavier's father unexpectedly passed away from a heart attack. And Xavier would make a very startling discovery. His dad had been keeping a pretty dark secret. While clearing out his father's apartment, he's looking for his father's precious ring, the Count Signet ring. He was also looking for money that his father had left for him, but he found nothing. Turns out, his dad wasn't rich. All Hubert had left for his family was a bunch of debt. He had been secretly struggling financially for the last couple of years. Xavier had no idea. So after this news of his lost fortune, Xavier's mother Genevieve also starts running into financial trouble, and she ended up filing for bankruptcy. With Xavier having struggled financially for many years, this was kind of his last hope. He hoped that his father's fortune could save him. So this really, to me, is like a nail in the coffin. But he did find one thing of significance in his father's rented apartment: his father's .22 caliber long rifle. Chapter 3. The Investigation, Part 1. Monday, April 11th, at around 2 p.m., a neighbor who had known the family and worked for them was walking by when she took notice that the family's shutters were closed. The neighbor immediately felt this was odd, as the family always left their shutters open, even when they were on vacation. She also noticed a letter taped onto their mailbox that said to stop leaving mail there and return it all to sender. 2 more days would pass, and the Dupont de Ligonnès family continued to have their shutters closed. The house that was normally filled with laughter and music, dogs barking, was completely silent. And so this neighbor called the police. Thursday, April 13th, 2011 would be the first time that the police would come to this home. They did a wellness check, but they would end up coming several more times. This first time they found the front door was locked, the shutters were still closed, and they ended up having to call a locksmith to open the door. Upon entry, police found the home in order and everything appeared normal. However, when I read through some other sources, I found some things that are troubling. They were talking about how some sheets had been removed from the bedrooms, the closets were open and empty, the dishes had been run, the fridge had been cleared out, family photos had been removed from the frames, guitars had been left out in the living room, and there was this unfinished game of chess. A mop in the kitchen was still wet. Agnes's sleep apnea machine that she had to sleep with every night had been left behind, along with a note on where to return the equipment. But the police believed at this time the family had left voluntarily and there were no signs of foul play. But the family's cars were also still there, all except for Xavier's C5, and this was also strange because Xavier's C5 wasn't big enough to fit his entire family and their dogs. So loved ones were pleading with police to investigate. Something was clearly wrong, but it wouldn't be for another 8 days before police would actually start an investigation. Thursday, April 21st, 2011, a wanted notice would be issued for the family. Later that same day, investigators searched the family's back garden, and this is when they would discover a piece of plywood covering a hole under the terrace filled with trash. Inside the hole, they found gardening tools, a dog bowl, and couch cushions. Underneath was freshly dug dirt, and as police went lower, they found a brand new layer of cement. So police broke this thin layer of cement, and underneath they discovered wallpaper, a thick layer of plastic, and the smell of decomposition. The first thing that police found was a human leg wrapped in a blue comforter. As they dug deeper, they would make the horrifying discovery that this was a mass grave. Under the terrace were the dismembered remains of Agnes, her 4 children, and their 2 Labrador dogs. The bodies had been delicately buried with care. They were wrapped in bedding, plastic, and burlap sacks, and covered in lime to mask the smell of decomp. According to some sources, religious objects were also found with the bodies. Some say this ties to Xavier's Catholic roots. Other people say Xavier was only Catholic in title. Agnes was wearing several of her favorite jewelry pieces. There was also with her a small wooden carving of a dove and a cross. Achu had been buried with a statue of the Virgin Mary. Anne had her severed arms crossed cleanly over her stomach. Benoît had been buried with a metal cross and pearl jewelry. Thomas was found in a separate grave next to the rest of the family, with his arms folded across his chest and a rosary next to his head. A lighter and a candle had also been thrown in with the bodies, and police couldn't help but notice a strong smell of alcohol, as if a bottle had been poured out for the dead. So autopsies were performed the next day, and it was found that the children had all been drugged and then shot. Some sources say Agnes was also drugged. It's believed all of the victims were asleep when the murders occurred, and the murder weapon was determined to be a .22 long rifle, the same weapon Xavier had just inherited 3 months prior from his father. To this day, the murder weapon has never been found. An international arrest warrant was issued to locate Xavier, and the family's funeral was held on April 28th at a church in Nantes. The family regularly attended this church, and there was a big turnout for the funeral. 1,400 people were there. There was a lot of security for the event, and the bodies were quickly cremated after the funeral. Meanwhile, the media and the papers were blowing up the story, labeling 55 Boulevard Schuman the House of Terror. And that's the name of the Unsolved Mysteries episode about this case. Which, by the way, I've got to say, that's like one of the first things that I watched about this story. And I cannot emphasize enough how much information was left out of that episode. They don't talk about the affairs at all. They don't talk about Genevieve and her cult. I believe a lot of the information about like forensically what was found later in the home was also left out. It's just like shocking how little information was presented. I understand that they have to like give it in a short time, but they really leave it open to possibility. Xavier was framed, and I really don't feel like it's speculation to me, and I know there's other people who feel this way as well, and most of France just collectively that has talked about this online. We all feel very strongly as a whole that it's incredibly obvious that Xavier murdered his entire family, it's really not up for discussion. So I just find it upsetting when like the media tries to portray it like this. Just dig a little deeper and you get all this information and it's like, well, 2 + 2 is 4, like, duh, you know? So police began to look into the family's lives leading up to the murder, and they started to come across some strange things. First, the lease on their house had been terminated. The family also owed a debt of 20,000 euro, according to some sources. There's some other sources I read that said they had paid off all of their debt, but we do know all their bank accounts had been closed, and the children's school had also received a final payment settlement. The house had been partially emptied, and this brings us to our second timeline, the lead up to the murders. About 2 months before the murders, on February 2nd, Xavier got his firearms license. And this was seen as strange to family and friends because Xavier had never touched a gun. His sons also started learning how to shoot. Xavier was 50 years old at this point. He had never wanted to take up shooting until inheriting this rifle from his dad. He also asked the instructor some very strange questions, like how to use a silencer. During this time, Agnes also wrote to a friend saying that her marriage was on the rocks and had become rigid and quasi-military. She also made it very clear she was aware of Xavier's ongoing affair with Catherine and that Xavier had drained her financially. Just 1 month before the murders, March 12th, Xavier purchased rifle bullets and a silencer that fit the .22 long rifle. He visited the shooting range 4 times between March 26th and April 1st. A receipt was also found from a store that was 3.5 hours away from the family home. This was a DIY store where large bin liners and a box of adhesive plastic paving slabs were purchased. On April 1st, Achu, the oldest son, did not show up for his job at the pizzeria to pick up his paycheck. And this was highly unusual, as he always came the first of each month to get his money. That same day, Xavier purchased cement, lime, and a shovel. April 2nd, Xavier purchased 4 bags of lime, 10 kilograms each, from various shops in the area. On Sunday, April 3rd, Thomas returned to university at 5 p.m., while the rest of the family dined in a restaurant in Nantes. Then they went to the movies to watch Rango. Around 10:30 p.m., Xavier called his sister Christine and left her a voicemail saying, quote, "We spent our Sunday evening in the cinema together, then in a restaurant, and we've just got back. I'm just calling to ask if it's too late to speak to you on the phone now, and I see it's gone to voicemail. But I was surprised. You spoke to me about Bertram, who's getting ready for his flight, but I thought he'd only just arrived. So I was a bit surprised. Anyway, sending you my love. If it's not too late, call me back or send me a text and I will call you. Okay, I'm going to put the kids to bed. Say hi to everyone. See you soon, maybe." End quote. And I have the audio from this voicemail that I'm going to play to you now.
On était à Pinoche en famille et au restaurant ensuite dimanche soir et on rentre juste. Donc je t'ai envoyé un petit truc pour te demander si c'était trop tard pour le téléphone et puis là je vois que t'es sur ton répondeur. Voilà, je t'embrasse. Si c'est pas trop tard, tu m'envoies un petit SMS et tout. Là je vais coucher les enfants et dire bonsoir à tout le monde. À tout de suite, peut-être.
Around 2 a.m., based on the family's phone activity, it's believed Agnes and all the children had gone to bed, but Xavier was still awake on a Catholic forum reading about moral sins. At 3:30 a.m., Agnes's sleep apnea machine was shut off. At 6 a.m., Xavier called Agnes's employer, saying she would not be coming in for work because she was ill, suffering from gastroenteritis. He also called Achu's university, saying he had been in a cycling accident. He called Anne and Benoit's private school and explained they also would not be showing up due to illness. Rumors began to circulate about how the family had left for Australia due to Xavier getting a job transfer. But the friends of the children found it very suspicious. They had not received any kind of warning about this. They tried contacting them several more times, online and by text, but they had no luck. Then there were the letters. An unsigned letter was given to the pizzeria where Archer worked. It was a letter of resignation. Later that same day, Xavier called his sister Christine and spoke to her for about half an hour. Christine would say this conversation appeared completely normal. Agnes's employer was notified via text that Agnes had been hospitalized, and the following week, her employer got a letter that appeared to be from Agnes saying that she was terminating her employment and she was following her husband to his job in Australia. A message was also placed on the mailbox at this point saying to return all mail to sender. Chapter 4. The Investigation, Part 2. On April 5th, Thomas was going about his day. He went to choir practice. Then that evening, he was picked up by Xavier. They ate at a high-end restaurant, arriving at about 9 o'clock. Xavier ordered an expensive, multi-course meal, as if they were celebrating. The two waiters later would recall that Thomas appeared unwell towards the end of the meal, and that Xavier and Thomas barely spoke to each other. Thomas ended up drawing the attention of multiple patrons because he was falling asleep during the meal. So some people believe, including myself, that Thomas was drugged by Xavier during this meal. Later that night, Xavier dropped Thomas off back at his dorm. The next day, Thomas woke up very confused and forgetful. He couldn't remember what had happened the night before. He's hanging out with his friend at his house in Angers. They were playing music and watching television, and Thomas planned to spend the rest of the day with his friend. But then he gets another message from his dad. Xavier is like, "You've got to come back to Nantes. It's really bad. Your mom has been in a serious cycling accident. She's in a coma. I don't know if she's going to make it." So Thomas is panicked. He eats quickly with his friend, and then he took a train back home around 10 o'clock. The last text message from Thomas was around midnight to his friend. His friend texted him back a little after midnight, but got no response. The following day, the friend tried to reach out to Thomas again, and some sources claim he never heard anything. Other sources claim the friend got several responses, but they were very brief, weirdly worded texts. They would say things like, "I'm not coming to yours, I'm ill, really ill, not coming to class." And there's some sources that basically say these texts did not sound like Thomas. 2 days after Thomas' departure, his friend received a text saying, "I'm out of battery, my dad's looking for a new charger for me." And this is the last time that Thomas' friend would hear anything from him or anyone in the family. There was another female friend who said they corresponded with Thomas that Tuesday on Facebook, but that he seemed very odd in his way of writing. Furthermore, the day before, the same friend had noticed Thomas seemed very lonely and had told her that he would skip classes on Wednesday to come to a music rehearsal. But he didn't turn up at the rehearsal, which was not like him. During the week, neighbors heard the family dogs howling for 2 consecutive nights, and then it became silent. Some say Thomas was killed last because Xavier hesitated. After all, he was the oldest biological son. He would have been the heir to the Dupont de Ligonnès fortune and carried on his family lineage. And remember, these titles were of great significance to Xavier. Police would later discover Xavier had spent that entire week inside of his house. He would not be seen outside until Wednesday, April 6th. He was seen alone by acquaintances in Nantes, and at some point that same day, Achu's girlfriend actually knocked on the door of the house, and she noticed a light was on the first floor. But the family's 2 Labradors didn't bark, and no one answered the door. Thursday, April 7th, several witnesses claimed to have seen Agnes alive. That same day, Xavier was seen making several return trips from the house to his car, loading the car with large bags. The neighbor also claimed to have spoken to Agnes after seeing her walking her dog. And this whole part really confused me because if you look at the general timeline, it seems like Agnes was likely murdered between April 3rd and April 4th. But then multiple people came forward saying they saw her several days later. people who knew her well, neighbors. There's another sighting that I think comes up later in my notes about her going to a hair salon and having an appointment and being seen there. And I understand you can get dates mixed up, but it's strange to me that multiple people could have mixed this up and all said the same day. So I don't know. I don't know what to think about this part. One of the neighbors that claimed to see Agnes also would later say she was quite certain that she saw her on Thursday because she remembered not having a lot of time to speak to Agnes because she had to go pick up her son from this appointment that he only went to on Thursdays. And then there was the saleswoman friend of Agnes that said she saw Agnes in her shop for a hair appointment either Thursday, April 7th or Friday, April 8th. However, it's still generally believed that Agnes, Benoît, Anne, and Agnes were murdered April 3rd or 4th, and that Thomas was murdered last, April 5th or 6th. Friday, April 8th, Xavier wrote on a Catholic online forum, and it was later confirmed that this was the last time he went online from the IP address of the family's home in Nantes. While he was on there, he also emailed his brother-in-law saying, quote, "Everything's fine, Bertram. You'll hear more detailed news soon through Christine. Bye for now. All the best, Xavier." So this is his sister Christine's husband. A message to his mom and sister was also sent, and on April 8th and 9th, Xavier cleared out the apartments of his two oldest sons. For 6 days, from April 9th to the 14th, more strange letters started to arrive to family and friends. These letters left the loved ones of the Dupont de Ligonnès family perplexed, and immediate suspicion would raise for some. While these letters circulated, Xavier left his home on Sunday, April 10th, and his car was flashed by speed cameras between Nantes and La Rochelle. Around noon, he was located in a restaurant with his credit card timestamps certifying this. Then in the evening, he stayed at a hotel in La Rochelle, and the next day he went south towards the southwest, and this is Monday, April 11th. Anne and Benoit's school received a letter signed by Xavier saying that Anne and Benoit would be withdrawing from the school and the family was moving to Australia due to urgent professional changes. With the letter was a check that took care of the children's school fees for the rest of the year. The Catholic school where Agnes worked also got the resignation letter at the same time, stating the same reason for leaving, and the headmaster was unable to reach Agnes when he tried to call her by phone. A typed, unsigned 8-page letter, and this is one of the most famous letters in this case, dated April 11th, was also sent to Xavier and Agnes's immediate family. In this letter, Xavier claims that he has been working secretly as a spy for the American Drug Enforcement Administration. That's right, the DEA. Xavier would claim he was working on infiltrating an international drug ring, and his family had to relocate to the US and be in the Federal Witness Protection Program. How convenient. No one would be able to contact them. He advised his relatives to post on their socials that the family had relocated to Australia. But there's no proof this letter was written by Xavier. The typed signature also lists Xavier, Agnes, Agnes, Thomas, Anne, and Benoit as authors. Agnes's family sent the letter to Nantes District Attorney saying, "Listen, he's saying all kinds of strange things. Agnes would have never left without telling us." What would be discovered as the police's investigation continued? Is Xavier out there somewhere still alive? Was he murdered and framed? Did he complete suicide? All of these things will be discussed in part 2. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, you are not alone. Resources are available. Contact your National Domestic Violence Hotline. And that concludes part 1 of this true crime deep dive, the story of the Dupont de Ligonnès murders. We will be getting into a lot more and wrapping up this insane story in part 2. If you enjoyed the way this story was told, be sure to let me know. If you're watching on YouTube, drop a comment down below. I want to hear y'all's theories about this case as well. Like this video and subscribe if you haven't. And if you're listening on a podcast platform, it would mean the world if you left a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening. It really helps the show. If you're listening on Spotify, you can leave a comment on this exact episode. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2. You all are amazing. I hope you have a great week, and please stay safe. I will talk to you soon. Bye.